A success story in logistics, World War II and the invasion of Normandy. It was a Tuesday, June 6, 1944. The coordinated efforts of the American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, to liberate Western Europe from the occupied German territory. This was D-Day. The battle was an enormous logistical undertaking, involving 12,000 planes, armored vehicles, 35,000 tanks, and 7,000 ships. Within 2 months, nearly 4 million troops were on the ground in France, supported by the material and supplies they needed to win the war. Although the battle was bloody and many lives were lost, the Allied forces achieved victory over the Germans. They did this by following the 7 principles of logistics. Responsiveness, providing the right support at the right place at the right time. Simplicity, avoiding unnecessary complexity in preparing, planning, and conducting logistics operations. Flexibility, adapting logistics support to changing conditions. Economy, employing logistics support assets effectively. Attainability, acquiring the minimum essential logistics support before combat operations begin. Sustainability, providing logistics support for the duration of the operation. And finally, survivability, ensuring that the logistics infrastructure prevails in spite of degradation and damage. An example of this historic logistics effort was the design, development, manufacture, and delivery of tanks from United States facilities to the beaches of Normandy. The tanks were designed and manufactured with responsiveness, simplicity, and economy in mind to support the Allied forces. By using existing production facilities, reuse of chassis from other pieces of existing heavy equipment, common spare parts, ease of transportability and repair, these tanks were used by every Allied army in every armored role on every front. Combat troops in the field had little or no formal mechanical training to repair these vehicles. When maintenance and repair was needed prior to sending them back to the battlefield, the expertise required for these tasks was diminished due to the emphasis on the simplicity of their design, the responsiveness of available spare parts, and the economy of the repairs in the field. The combination of these logistics principles resulted in an overwhelming force capability. In an effort to support the war, in 1942, American automobile makers redirected their focus from automobiles to tanks and converted their commercial factories into tank manufacturing facilities. As in the automobile industry, mass production was a key element to producing the product in an efficient and affordable manner. The same held true in making tanks and trucks for the war effort. The chassis were engineered and designed to fit several different vehicles, and spare parts common to bulldozers, tanks, tank retrievers, tank destroyers, and mine-clearing vehicles were also manufactured in the same manner. Employing the logistics principles of simplicity, economy, and flexibility resulted in an inexpensive tank that could be inexpensively supported. Rail was the primary means of shipment in the United States. Using this existing transportation method without modification, tanks were shipped to a rail car, similar to automobile shipping, and were transported from the production facility to the ports that could accommodate their embarkation and shipment. Accomplishing this without modification was a significant factor in the ability of the United States to forward supply Allied forces. Four East Coast ports were utilized: Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. These ports provided more than enough logistics capacity to supply the buildup and sustainment of forces. The tanks and equipment were gathered at staging areas at all 4 ports in the same manner, providing attainability and sustainability. After the tanks and materials were loaded onto ships, they rendezvoused northeast of Boston and traveled for 15 to 20 days in convoys under military escort across the Atlantic Ocean to the port of Liverpool, England. Liverpool provided a safe offload and staging area for the war machines, where they awaited further transportation by truck and rail to the training and staging areas in southern Britain. These staging areas provided the American, British, and Canadian forces the opportunity to train the troops and maintain the tanks and equipment in preparation for the Normandy invasion. Upon completion of training, the tanks and units moved to assembly areas in preparation for embarkation aboard landing craft and the trip across the English Channel to Normandy, ready for battle. It was at this time that the logistics principles of responsiveness and attainability came into focus. On D-Day, the Allied forces came ashore on the beachheads of Gold, Juno, Utah, Omaha, and Sword. The armies were followed with the supplies and equipment they needed to support this huge combat operation. The fighting was fierce, and the single-day casualties huge. But at the end of the day, the beachheads were established, secured, and 160,000 combat personnel were on the beaches of France. Over the next 2.5 months, 440,000 vehicles, including tanks, transports, trucks, and other combat vehicles, would offload onto the beaches of Normandy. Within weeks, the Allied forces had pushed the Germans away from Cherbourg Peninsula, which allowed for the establishment of material staging areas and repair facilities to rapidly respond to the logistics material requirements of the combat forces. This was a tremendous advantage to the Allied forces, as the supply lines for the Germans were stretched across several fronts. Despite incidental shortages of supplies, material, and fuel, overall, the Allies never outran their supply lines. The Allied forces advanced rapidly against the Germans, and cities were liberated throughout the country. By the end of August, the Allied forces had liberated France. It was accomplished through overwhelming numbers, support of those numbers, and superior logistics. The fast-moving Allied forces required fast-moving field maintenance support. The 347th Ordnance Depot Company provided that direct support as it followed the forces into battle, with support vehicles and parts for the tanks, and at times, behind enemy lines. A remark by a captured German soldier summarizes what the Germans termed Materialschlacht, or the material battle. As he marched past the many logistic stockpiles that marked the French landscape, he remarked, "I know how you defeated us. You piled up the supplies and let them fall on us." Like no other war in history, the war in Europe was a battle between German and US industrial capacity. In the end, superior logistics prevailed. The liberation of Paris generated a celebration in the streets, alongside the tanks that had become the iconic symbol of victory over the Germans. World War II was not over, but the end was in sight, as the Allied forces advanced on the German homeland from all directions. The magnitude of supplying 4 million combat troops an ocean away, what the Germans called Materialschlacht, was an overwhelming success. From the factories in the Midwestern United States to the liberation of Paris, it was all made possible by effectively applying the 7 principles of logistics: responsiveness, simplicity, flexibility, economy, attainability, sustainability, and survivability.